You need other things for effective democracy besides just majority rule, but that's certainly the most important thing. I mean, or you could have a democracy that is but illiberal at the same time. Yeah, sure. I mean, the way that the vaccine rollout is done has been done is extremely political and not fair to developing countries. Some of whom are being forced to either wait in line or they may have to work with China on China's vaccine rollout. I think ideally the US should rejoin trade agreements in Asia. That's very difficult to do. Biden can't do that by himself. He needs to do that with the support of Congress, and that's pretty hard to do.
Good evening, New York. Good morning, Jakarta. This is your host, Jamil Maidan Flores, wishing you the best in these uncertain times. Friends, in a moment we will have with us a special guest, Mr. Joshua Kurlantzick, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia at the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, non-partisan think tank. He is the author of several influential books, including a widely discussed one, Democracy in Retreat, The Revolt of the Middle Class and the Worldwide Decline in Representative Government. He has intensively studied Southeast Asian politics and economics, as well as China's relations with its neighbors. Hence, his first book was Charm Offensive: How China's Soft Power is Transforming the World. Today, he remains focused on China's relations with Southeast Asia, and I'm proud to tell you that he is a contributor to Pinter, Politik. I can tell you more about Mr. Joshua Kurlantzick and his writings in a way that will do justice to his achievements, but that will take more time than we have. And so, my friends, please welcome our special guest, Joshua Kurlantzick. Welcome, Mr. Kurlantzick. Mr. Kurlantzick, may I call you Joshua? Joshua is so much easier on the Malay tongue. My first question is quite predictable. How are you, and at the personal level, how are you and your loved ones and your friends, and how are you all coping with the rigors of the pandemic?
Okay, it's pretty similar to Jakarta. There are a lot of people at home, and the US has not handled it particularly well, but we're coping.
Do you feel more optimistic now that about the course of the pandemic, that you have a president-elect who is paying attention and who has a plan for dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, the US system is a little bit unusual among big democracies compared to most other big democracies like Indonesia, United Kingdom, others, where the president, the actual election, it's still another 3 months until 2.5 months until the person takes office. So there's more than a month until Biden becomes president. And I guess I'm a little bit optimistic. I mean, I'm optimistic by the fact that they have developed a vaccine in a fairly short period of time, but it takes a while to roll it out. But I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic, but it's hard to be optimistic right now with a lot of, we're still facing a lot of really serious problems.
Well, one concerning thing here is that although it is clear that Joseph Biden is the president-elect, the idiosyncrasies of American electoral politics makes us in Southeast Asia wonder if the delays and the complexities of the transfer of power will hamper Biden's ability to govern and to carry out foreign policy. Should we indeed worry about that?
One of my colleagues wrote an article about this. Almost very, very other democracies have as long a period of time between an election and someone taking power. So in the US, that was already a problem even before this transition. It's just a very long period of time. I don't think it will affect Biden's ability to make foreign policy, actually. I think that's the least of his concerns. In foreign policy, the US's policy has often changed very dramatically from president to president, changed an enormous amount. And so if Biden pursues a very different policy from Trump and Trump pursues a very different policy from Obama, that's actually not that unusual. But what's unusual this time is the level of turmoil in U.S. domestic politics and level of uncertainty and level of polarization. Actually, I think in terms of Biden has more ability to control foreign policy in the U.S. system than he does domestic policy, because foreign policy is mostly made by the president with his advisors without that much influence of the legislature, of Congress. So it's actually his domestic priorities that will be a lot harder for him to. There's some things related to foreign policy that are hard for the U.S. president to do without Congress, like to join a trade deal, but other things are not so challenging. So, like in the case of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, the Trump administration has taken certain measures to Southeast Asia, like labeling Vietnam a currency manipulator or applying trade pressure on Indonesia and Thailand, that Biden administration could quickly and easily reverse. But in terms of U.S. domestic policy, it's a lot harder to do. Unlike in Indonesia, where often politicians from different parties go to join the party of the president, or they want to make a coalition with the party of the president. Like before that, a lot of different politicians wanted to work with the Democrat Party when SBY was president. That just doesn't happen in the U.S. The parties are too ideological. They don't come together and work on things for transactional reasons or because they want to work together with the president. It just doesn't happen. There's no coalition, so he'll have a lot of domestic policy challenges.
What makes the United States unique is the U.S. Electoral College. But there is a view. There is a view that the U.S. Electoral College, with origins connected to slavery, is an anachronism that is irreconcilable with the principle of majority rule. To many people, majority rule is the essence of democracy. Do you have a feeling that the Electoral College should be abolished?
Right. Well, I mean, you need other things for effective democracy besides just majority rule, but that's certainly the most important thing. I mean, or you could have a democracy that is but illiberal at the same time. So, for example, when Thaksin Shinawatra was prime minister of Thailand, or even now that Prayut Chan-o-cha is prime minister of Thailand, Thaksin was elected by a very significant majorities in the early 2000s, and Prayut's party did win a very significant percentage of votes, but they still took actions that were not very liberal. Under Thaksin, the Thai government pursued a war in southern Thailand that killed a lot of mostly Muslim civilians, and they undermined the judiciary and things like that. So I don't think that just majority rule, but obviously the U.S. system in which the majority rule often does not lead to a victory is seriously flawed. So I would say for sure the Electoral College is a huge problem and has become more of a problem in the last 20 years. So ideally there would be some way to abolish it, but the U.S. system is very, I don't know how to say this best, calcified, but I'm not sure if that's going to be understood. It's very set in stone and hard to change. Yeah, it's a lot harder to change than a lot of other systems.
It looks like you'll have to live with it for some time more.
Yeah.
The anti-COVID-19 vaccines are now being rolled out, and a growing number of people are being vaccinated in the Western world. Shouldn't poorer countries worry that they may be left behind or may be left out in the distribution of vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real concern. I mean, I should say that the U.S. hasn't actually vaccinated very many people. There are other countries that have, the U.S. has the money to buy a huge amount of vaccines, but actually there are other countries, including the European regions, including the European Union and Canada, that have already paid for even more vaccines as a proportion of their population. But yeah, sure. I mean, the way that the vaccine rollout has been done is extremely political and not fair to developing countries. Some of whom are being forced to either wait in line, or they may have to work with China on China's vaccine rollout. They're not China hasn't released, like Brazil has worked with China quite closely. Some countries in Southeast Asia have considering. China hasn't released a lot of data about their vaccine. So yeah, it's a fairly unfair setup. Although it's not only the US, other wealthy countries, European Union, Canada, Japan have also dominated a huge percentage of buying the initial vaccines.
In relation to that, the pandemic has changed the conduct of diplomacy in an obvious way. The diplomatic dialogue is now conducted through online technology and instead of in-person dialogues. And the prevalent subject of international talk now is vaccines and vaccine logistics. But has the pandemic changed geopolitics in a more fundamental way?
I mean, I think that the pandemic has exposed to a lot of other countries significant weaknesses in the United States that probably people who were living in the US system or were at least cogent observers of the US system were aware of, but was covered up somewhat by other things isn't always apparent to people. So there's that, and that has certainly, I think, to some people who maybe not following U.S. politics that closely before, and this has an impact on geopolitics, and weren't as aware of the gridlock and polarization and problems in U.S. politics, even after Trump was elected, really have been shocked by the U.S.'s response to COVID-19. The U.S. is not leading, but it's failing to protect its own citizens. It's been the response to COVID-19 has been much better by countries like Thailand and Vietnam. So I think that has an effect in geopolitics. It weakens the U.S.'s influence, perhaps provides a vacuum for China to step into it. In terms of the beyond that for the pandemic, I don't know. I think it's a little too soon to say. If they can produce more vaccines and eventually enough countries have vaccination coverage and feel comfortable, perhaps diplomacy will just go back to the way it was before. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you, but this isn't really a good substitute for people going to places and seeing the places in person. You know, I was in Southeast Asia, I was in Thailand just before COVID, and since then, I have not gone to Southeast Asia at all. I have not been able to. And even though it's nice to talk to people on the phone or on Zoom, it's not the same as going and seeing them. So I don't think you can really have a full substitute.
In relation to that again, because the COVID-19 has spread so rapidly, catching governments without a concerted response to the pandemic, many are beginning to think that the USled international order founded in the wake of World War II is in disarray and can no longer be relied on, and that there is now a global leadership vacuum as the United States withdrew from various multilateral arrangements. What is your take on this perspective?
Well, I'm not sure that post-World War II order was ever one that Indonesia was particularly fond of, certainly not in the Sukarno era and not even in the early post-Sukarno era. So yeah, I mean, I think that that order has, if there ever really existed, been shown to be flawed, if not essentially have collapsed. I think that some aspects of that were central to that order, if you want to call it, again, a lot of countries didn't subscribe to that order, including really Indonesia, at least at the beginning. So it wasn't certainly an order of everyone, but a lot of the fundamentals of that have been picked up by other countries, even if without certain leadership. I mean, even though the U.S. has not really been involved in trade deals in Asia for 5 years at least now, major trade deals have passed. Both the RCEP and the TPP then changed, and leadership has been picked up by other countries, including Japan and to some extent China. So I don't think that some of the things that were underlying that order are gone, but yeah, the U.S.'s leadership has been largely absent for several years.
Well, before I ask you whether China is going to be the next undisputed global hegemon, let me do a change of pace. Economics is said to be a dismal science, but I think I have a feeling the geopolitics is even more dismal. How did you get to dive into geopolitics? Were you always into this field?
No, actually, I was a journalist I guess that's sort of in the same field, but I worked for the local press in Thailand, and then I worked for Agence France Presse in Thailand. This was about more than 20 years ago, 22 years ago. And for several years, I worked in Thailand and then covered all of Southeast Asia. And then at that time, journalism was still doing very well financially, not so much anymore. I moved back to the U.S. and I was a journalist at several U.S. publications, many of which are not doing well financially now. And then I sort of moved into the more policy analyst world, writing books, things like that. Doing articles and things like that. And so moved more towards geopolitics from just sort of, I originally started with just news journalism, news reporting.
Who were your greatest intellectual influences?
I don't know, that's a hard question. When I was doing journalism or just in general? Writing essays, I always liked George Orwell. I don't know if I could say there was one intellectual influence. I can say that I moved to Southeast Asia in the late 1990s. And I was pretty young. I'm not a child, but I was a fairly young adult. And I was really struck by the combination of two things. And one was that for several decades, going back in Thailand to the 1960s, there have been several generations of people, one after the next. Thailand had some of the highest growth rates in the world, even higher than Indonesia in the Suharto period. That there had been several generations of people where you could visibly see that their families had gotten wealthier and they were living longer and they were in better health and overall development had improved. And then in the period that I was there, not having anything to do with me, but in the period I was there starting in 1997, that all stopped like that. And the political order in Indonesia certainly, but also in Thailand, even though it wasn't so visible at first, the political order completely collapsed. It wasn't as visible as Indonesia because Thailand was not run by a dictatorship. It was run by a shaky coalition of Democrats. But the political order collapsed and eventually Thailand gave way to the era of the Shinawats and then coups and bad Shinawats. And of course, the political order collapsed in Indonesia. So without knowing one intellectual influence, I was really struck by how both there had been all this enormous economic development and then almost seemed to many people overnight, the political system collapsed and countries are still dealing with that. I mean, Indonesia has actually dealt with it a lot better than Thailand, certainly not without flaws. But one intellectual influence, I don't know.
Well, speaking of China, China has exploited the publicity value of the Regional Cooperation for Economic Progress, or RCEP, or RCEP as we call it here, and it's raking in a lot of credit for sponsoring it. But the fact remains that originally it was an ASEAN initiative, and we believe to this day that it's still an ASEAN initiative. But do you see any danger that China will effectively take over ownership of RCEP and use it to further its dominance in the region?
Yeah, I think further is the right word because China is already, not in terms of investment, but in terms of trade, China is already the dominant actor in Southeast Asia. RCEP may extend China's dominance in trade, but China is already the dominant trading partner in Southeast Asia, nearly everywhere in Southeast Asia. So even without RCEP, China is already the trade. Hegemon isn't really the right word for trade, but China is already the dominant trading actor. I think that China already took ownership of, if you can have ownership of a trade deal, China already took the ownership from ASEAN of RCEP a long time ago. I mean, I think historically one of the problems with ASEAN has been, maybe not historically, but in the era after Suharto, Mahathir, Lee Kuan Yew, and those people passed from the scene, one of the problems with ASEAN has been that ASEAN has a lot of good ideas, but it sort of is reluctant to stand up to any of the major powers. It sees itself as a place where the major powers can come together, which is good, but it also means that when the major powers like China, want to take over an initiative like RCEP, they just do. And since no one really speaks individually for ASEAN, and ASEAN does not have as globally known leaders as Lee Kuan Yew or Mahathir or Suharto were back in that time, then something like RCEP becomes linked to China. I honestly doubt most people outside of ASEAN even know that RCEP was started by ASEAN. I think that in the wider world, if you asked most people, even educated people, where RCEP came from, they would think it came from China. Most people outside of Southeast Asia, wouldn't even know that it didn't come from China.
Well, one thing that could have changed the character of of RCEP is the presence of India in that, because India is a dialogue partner of ASEAN. It should be there, but it chose not to be there. Did India make a big mistake in opting out of RCEP?
Well, I mean, I'm not a specialist in India's politics, but I mean, probably from an economic standpoint, yes, probably. I mean, RCEP is going to be, even though RCEP is not fully a free trade deal, it really sort of puts into place a lot of things that were already there and moves slowly. Yeah, I mean, I think India should have been a part of it. For both because it probably would have benefited India economically, but also a lot of ASEAN countries would have been happier with both China and India in it, and it would have given India more influence to be in the deal rather than being outside it. So I don't know enough to comment about India's domestic politics, but yeah, I would think it would have been better for them.
Well, still speaking of China, during this decade, China has been quite aggressive in pursuing its disputed territorial claims virtually over all of the South China Sea. And in recent months, it has been also audacious in expanding its territorial claims in the Himalayas. So far, the U.S. response is to carry out freedom of navigation operations and to invite other nations to do the same. What more do you think the U.S. should do to effectively respond to this China's increasingly aggressive stance on its territorial claims?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I think one of the challenges is that some, but not all of the countries that are actually claimant states in addition to China are either don't want to respond too much to China for some reasonable reasons, like they don't want to anger China, or in the case of the Jokowi administration, they're just more focused on domestic priorities, including infrastructure and economic reform and things like that. So for the U.S., it's challenging because of that. I mean, there are regional claimant states. There's some regional claimant states like Vietnam that are very aggressive in pushing back, but others like the Philippines, Indonesia somewhat, and Malaysia somewhat that sometimes push back against what China does, but at other times are fairly quiet, which is understandable from a regional perspective. But I'm not sure what else the U.S. can do, honestly. I mean, the situation has changed in the South China Sea so much in just 10 or 15 years that the U.S.'s position is, even as admitted by public testimony by Pacific Command, by the U.S. military, is significantly weaker. It doesn't mean that if there was actually a conflict in the South China Sea that the U.S. wouldn't have a lot of power, but in terms of on a day-to-day basis, China has significantly changed the sort of dynamic. And you combine that with the fact that Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, less so other Vietnam, etc., are reluctant themselves to stand up for their own claims, which I understand. It makes it a really challenging situation. Indonesia has kind of moved, back and forth. Like sometimes the Jokowi administration has taken very strong public actions, like blowing up Chinese fishermen's boats. But those actions aren't, which I'm not even sure is really a useful use time, but those actions have not been sustained. And the Jokowi administration, similar to Malaysia and the Philippines, is caught between two poles. They want Chinese investment and need Chinese investment for infrastructure and other needs. And they're understandably upset about China's South China Sea policies, and they're not sure how to handle both things, which is reasonable but difficult.
Well, on U.S.-Indonesia relations, it seems that until the U.S. can effectively compete with China in helping President Jokowi realize his national agenda, mostly infrastructure building and control of the pandemic, growth in trade and FDIs, they are very much concerned about this. China will always be ahead of the U.S. in its relationship with Indonesia because of its willingness to engage economically and financially. And this is true not only of Indonesia, but other countries in Southeast Asia. What initiatives can the Biden administration take in order to close that gap?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think ideally the U.S. should rejoin trade agreements in Asia. That's very difficult to do. Biden can't do that by himself. He needs to do that with the support of Congress, and that's pretty hard to do. I think that it's, with Indonesia in particular, it is a bigger challenge than some of the other countries because, like I said, some of the other regional countries, Vietnam, Singapore, to some extent Malaysia. Definitely when Mahathir was prime minister, and even now, there is more of a foreign policy focus to the government that, while building economic ties with China, also is not solely focused on the economy, whereas Jokowi is really, at least to an outsider, I've not personally met Jokowi, I've seen him speak a few times, he seems totally focused on the economy, which is reasonable, and he still seems to look at the economy, even now, well into a second term, like a mayor, which again is understandable, but is challenging from a foreign policy perspective in that he's focused on infrastructure, which is fine, and in a very sort of mayor type way in which he has a very direct, hands-on approach, but it's very challenging to conduct foreign policy that way. Sorry, that's a long answer. I think that Biden should try to signal that the U.S. is going to try to rejoin regional trade agreements. I think the U.S. should pay attention to countries' regional concerns, such as showing up for major regional meetings again after the pandemic, if the pandemic is addressed, giving a higher level representation to regional states, and like paying actual attention to ASEAN regional states, making a higher priority issues that are of importance in the region, including climate change and trade, trying to get a better understanding of why regional states are so focused on infrastructure, understanding that there is an enormous infrastructure gap and the US can do something, can do more than the Trump administration did to try to fill it, along with partners like Japan. So I think there are things Biden can do, but those come with a recognition that even if Joe Biden had complete control over the US with no Congress and he could do whatever he wanted, the US would not at this point be able to compete with China in terms of financing, particularly for infrastructure. It's not something that the US could or even would do at this point. China has China has rolled it back a little bit. They've come to have some of their own concerns about BRI, but China just has a lot more money to throw at infrastructure than the US does. Like I said, I think the situation is going to be challenging. The dynamic has changed a lot in the United States, but also in China. I think China has become much more authoritarian in the late Hu era and certainly in Xi's era. It has become more assertive and for some reasons, good reasons and bad reasons, more confident. And the US has become more hawkish about China too. Trump is a symptom of a problem of intense polarization and a lot of other issues, including misinformation and inequality and rage at the political system that he fed his rise and that pre-existed him.